Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 137. And this episode, we wanted to talk about indie games. We talk about indie games a lot of episodes, and we actually a while back had the episode Indie Indeed, where Matt and I tried to kind of parse the definition or splitting hairs on what defines an indie video game. But we're going at it again because the discussion never stops, and it probably never will. There's no real end game on that. So fortunately, that keeps us in business. But also, we're upping the ante, and we're bringing in experts. Or at least an expert.
Oh, dear.
You're more expert than us. Joining us, we have Jill Grodt, who is a editor, writer, I'm blanking on a term of just running the Indie Informer. In fact, the blog.
In title and in sight.
Like, give me the most outlandish possible title, like Director Supreme or something I would go with.
Yes. The Grand Kai Commodore of Indie Informer, Jill Grodt.
I love it.
Descending from on high to speak of that which is beneath the triple A's.
Can I just have you to introduce me to rooms whenever I walk in?
You know what? I come with my own trumpet. I could herald anyone.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Hello, everyone.
Hello, welcome.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me and I can descend from on high.
Can you tell that Geoff is a voice actor? Just a little? Jill, I'm so excited to have you on. We have sort of crossed paths as I've edited episodes you've been on of the Game Informer show. And when you moved on to take on the world of indie on your shoulders and bring us the Indie Informer, which is an incredible site and you do incredible writing for, I immediately wanted to have you on because Geoff and I said we talk about indie games a lot, and I've started to notice things, and I noticed this actually at PAX West, which I went to this year. There are tons of huge booths at these conventions, and Nintendo always has something lavish with statues and all sorts of stuff. But one of the first big booths I saw when I walked into part of the hall was a giant Devolver Digital booth, and I mean giant, like a huge chunk of the room. And I thought to myself, that's awesome. And then I thought to myself, wait, that's pretty big for Devolver. They're an indie studio. Like most indies, Yacht Club and a bunch of others who were there had these, 4-panel little places with 5 TVs and that's it. And then Devolver had this huge spread and it got me thinking, as these indie developers get bigger, are they really indie? What does indie mean? Is it starting to move towards the direction of indie music where it's a sound or a style more than a fact hard term? And to start, I'm curious what your stance is on that. How do you define indie, especially in your space and on the site?
Yeah, so this is a conversation I have a lot considering my interests.
Here.
Unfortunately, there's no real answer, and that sucks for a lot of people because they want a nice, neat little package to put things in.
We want the numbers score.
Exactly, which I don't do on my site. I don't score by numbers. And
here.
There's kind of a thought that I enjoy throwing out there just to make people more angry with me. It's sort of like I graduated with a degree in art history, among other things, and some of the discussions that came out of that are, what is the definition of art? How do you define what art is? And cut to the chase, there really is no definition. So it's sort of an indie game is an indie game, and you will know it when you see it. Sort of, but you can't really sit down and say, okay, these are the qualities of an indie game. This is exactly how you put it into categories. The traditional sort of thought process is it has to do with money and how money is given to a project or whatever. I have a lot of problems with that particular definition, but I suspect that we will go into that as time goes on. But that's my sort of overview of what I think of for indie games.
Traditionally, I believe it came from the idea of publishers.
Yes. For people who are real sticklers to what they quote unquote believe is the definition of indies, is that indie being an independent project made by somebody, put out by that person, and not published by anyone, not getting money. So for some people, of an indie publisher is no longer indie. The problem I have with that is when you push people who have that really staunch belief of that definition, you start to get differences even within that particular category. So if the project gets crowdfunded money, is it still considered an indie? And most people will then say yes, of course, because it's not a publisher.
Mhm.
If they get money from a national sort of aid program for making video games, is that still considered an indie? Because now the entire government is backing, like,
It's a public works game.
right, exactly. And then people will split out from there saying, no, that's not, or yes, that is. Is it still an indie if it's published by one of the smaller indie publishers? And some people will split off and say no, and then yes. And then as we get into the Annapurna Interactives and Devolver Digitals, then people will split off. I even go so far as to say things like It Takes Two, for me, counts as an indie because it was published by EA Originals, which is not EA.
Yes.
EA Originals was created as a program, probably for EA to get some good buzz
Yeah.
to reward indies. And like, it's very hard for me to say, okay, you conceived of this in your own space, you worked with yourself or a small team on this concept, and then you won or earned or were able to talk to the right people to get a lot of funding for your game from a big place. And now all of a sudden I can't count you as indie. That's a hard thing for me,
Yeah.
But then there are some sort of clear-cut differences. So I recently had the example of Fall Guys being picked up by Epic. And so now I no longer consider that an indie because they are very much under the umbrella of Epic. It is 100% like an Epic game since the new sort of season relaunch.
Especially because it is a game that is an actively developed game. It is a live game.
Yes, 100%. So these definitions are never going to be 100% like this is the definition. And even people across this industry are having real troubles figuring out exactly what defines an indie. And even I enjoy sometimes on my website, which is indie dedicated, kind of putting like indie and indie adjacent games on there because they do speak to what I find so interesting about indie games in general. I don't know if I've like talked through all of your talking points or not, but I'll throw it back over to you.
No, because this discussion never stops and there's no easy answer to it. I mean, I'm even thinking of, Fall Guys, it's an actively developed thing. It is a game as service sort of game because of the seasons and everything else. But then there are games that start off very much easily defined as an indie game, but then they get a re-release or they get picked up by a publisher one way or another. I'm thinking of Cave Story in particular as an example of this, which is one of those games that was infamously developed by one person, but then gets enough different re-releases and versions and gets published by Nice Software, who are, they're not a household name in the West necessarily, unless you really like Prinnies, and I do, but they've definitely been around for a very long time and have put out a lot of storied series, so that I would not call them an indie publisher. So does that take away the indie crown or the designation from Cave Story? And speaking personally, I don't think so.
Right.
Because there's only certain like quality of life, and it's just like we're getting it onto the system. We're just like cramming it onto the 3DS, onto the Switch, onto whatever it is. But other games become a little more nebulous, or maybe either one of you or anyone else would argue with me that the second more money touches it, it stops being indie.
Right.
Well, I mean, the more recent example is Cuphead, right? Like Cuphead was an indie game.
Yes.
And then it got picked up by Xbox and was exclusive to Xbox for a period of time. Now it's everywhere. But like, that a lot of people are like, well, it's not indie now. They've got Xbox money, but I don't know that that's necessarily true.
Not everyone gets all of the Xbox money. It's not like a big
Bill
bin.
Spencer doesn't show up
They
with a
walk
giant
into a
paper
room
check.
with just, it's like Scrooge McDuck's like vault. Please
Right,
have it.
exactly.
And it gets complicated too when you think about it sort of the other way. When like Destiny broke away and became independent, like
Right, Bungie went off on its own.
Bungie goes off on its own. Is that? I thought really seriously for a while about doing an article about indies talking about Bungie going independent and Double Fine's getting picked up.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that too, and like, I'm glad that Double Fine got picked up because Psychonauts 2 was one of my favorite games that year, and like, I guarantee that if without Xbox's help, it was no secret that Double Fine was struggling and trying to find their groove, and it had some missteps, and so like, it ultimately I think really helped that game. But like, I know one of Jill's favorite games of the year and of all time, and recently mine too, and Jeff's as well. Tunic,
Woo.
like Tunic was developed by a guy.
Mm-hmm.
That guy happens to know the head of Finji, and like they were friends and wanted to collaborate and ended up being published by Finji. And Finji is a smaller indie publisher.
Right.
They develop their own stuff, and they've also been publishing a bunch
They
of stuff.
publish out of their home. Like, I don't even think they have an office
Yes.
space, if I
Right.
remember.
And so, like, it's one of those things. How do you compare Tunic, which has the small, made by one guy, plus a composer and a few other people, like there was help here and there.
Power up audio and
Right. Yep. And compare that to literally any Annapurna game, some of which are also one person, and then others that have this huge team. It's such a strange, incongruous thing. And even like talking about one of our favorite indie publishers, we talk about Shovel Knight and Yacht Club constantly.
Just about every episode, yeah.
But there was a lot of hubbub when they did the Kickstarter for Mina, and I was even a little leery because like Shovel Knight's been a huge success, and like it's not like there was just the one version. It's been republished and packaged on every modern platform. Plus, they've done spin-offs and additions without Kickstarters. Dig and Pocket Dungeon didn't have Kickstarters. So like for them to go back to Kickstarter for Mina, a lot of people are like, oh, interesting. Typically, I wouldn't question that for indie publishers, right? There's tons of other indie publishers we've talked about who started as Kickstarter games. Geoff and I kickstarted a Castlevania visual novel mashup called Romancylvania. I think it was last year that still hasn't come out yet. That
Something
is
like that.
obviously, I would consider an indie game. But a lot of people kind of shrugged at Mina getting a Kickstarter campaign because they figured, well, if they were publishing these other games without Kickstarter, why are they going back to it? You know, and I don't think there's a hard right or wrong, but it was definitely curious. Whereas if they had always done Kickstarter and they'd never stopped, it would be kind of like Way Forward, who when they kickstarted Half Genie Hero, it was a similar thing that people were like, oh, okay, you've kickstarted other stuff. But then Seven Sirens didn't have a Kickstarter. Seven Sirens, they published under their own Steam. Both River City Girls, they published under their own Steam. And so like, I'm always aware of that and kind of curious where it's going. And I pick on Annapurna and Devolver a lot, not because I think that there's a problem, but because they are two of the biggest names in indie development. And I love their games. It comes from a place of love. I don't know that I would have as much access to indie games if it weren't for publishers like that, right? Because they put out so much stuff and make it aware. I think about 12 Minutes a few years ago, which ultimately I think I hated. But like, just, it's complicated.
The conversation happened.
It was,
But it made that indie game a household name. Everyone knew about that game because it had been in development for so long. It had these big names attached, and Annapurna had that huge reach, right? And I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer to it, but it has made me think a lot more. But it also pushes me, and I'm curious for you too, it pushes me to find more indies, right? Like find more games. Like I know one of Geoff and my's favorite from this year, Citizen Sleeper. Like I heard about it from a friend of the show and a friend of mine, Eric Van Allen, was talking about it. We saw it at I think one of the E3 presentations, and then both of us were like, oh my God, I want to play this thing. And I loved it. And that was fun because that was also developed by one person and is outside of big publishers. And so I think while I don't know if it's good or bad for the industry, I know it's good for my tastes because it makes me think harder about what I want to consume and where I want to look for stuff.
right. There's also a very interesting wrinkle in the kind of monetary discussion here too, because if you want to have indies just be 100% under the power of the creator, and they have to figure out how to market and most importantly, just like fund their own way through things, that's usually how people think of as indies. But think about the amount of people that cuts completely out of the conversation. People who cannot go 2-3 years of their lives completely self-funding a game unless you already have that stability in your life. If you have a following, then you can't really like do that. I mean, it would be a Herculean task, and I appreciate anybody who has, but that's another side of the story. Like these larger publishers like Devolver and Annapurna are creating a sort of diversity of voice and the people who can create games. And even if it's 12 Minutes, which was no one's favorite game, I believe.
Not here now.
It is one of those things where it's like you're getting huge movie stars attached to indie games. You're getting all these people who might never have heard of an indie game before suddenly hearing about all of this because of these names being attached. So it is in a way promoting and furthering kind of the indie cause, even if the game itself was not fantastic.
Yeah. It's a matter of perspective and identity, I think, because a lot of this is, as we're already finding, and we'll continue to discuss, the fact that you kind of bring your internal calibration to what you think this is and where you think it is. And it's interesting to think about the fact that even something like, as we're talking about Devolver and Annapurna, looking at those and knowing that when one of them puts out a game, when they publish a game, you expect a certain kind of, not necessarily aesthetic, not necessarily length or genre or anything, but there is a je ne sais quoi. There is a mood or mode to it. And in thinking about it off the top of my head, it's almost like Annapurna games feel like some sort of weird Criterion Collection or art film kind of game. Whether they are or they aren't, that's usually where I start when I see their logo. Whereas Devolver, I almost imagine late 80s, early 90s MTV. Like the liquid television era of programming that MTV put out. Whether it was raunchy or not, whether it was adult or not, there's a certain amount of just like, they're going over there.
Yeah.
Is it old? Is it new? I don't know. And it gets you started on that. And older days for bigger publishers and bigger studios had that sort of personality to them. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good or a bad thing that a studio or publisher has that or not, but it is a current effect of that.
Yeah. And we touched on this a little bit before, but like, so I was lucky enough to go to the Gearbox software presentation at PAX West. And I say lucky, it was interesting. Let's just say that. Randy Pitchford, love or hate, is definitely an interesting person. He's not boring. But when I was there, I forgot that they had gotten into publishing, and like there were indie companies and developers that I'd forgotten went under that umbrella. Like Heart Machine is part of that now. And so I never played Hyper Light Drifter, but Solar Ash I played last year and fell in love with and want 4 more of that game, which I know I won't get, but like I just loved everything about it. And so the new like spiritual successor to Hyper Light Drifter is the first of their games to come out under this new Gearbox software publishing umbrella. And I don't love Gearbox right now for a whole host of reasons. Yeah. But I love Heart Machine and I loved Solar Ash and I want to support them. And I mean, this is a whole separate conversation that we've touched on, but like supporting problematic development houses, and is there a right way? Is there a wrong way? Right? Like there's no yes or no, right? Like I still play Overwatch, but like I'm not happy with what Blizzard's doing. People still bought Cyberpunk. Like there's no right answer to this, right? But it does give me pause when a big publisher who has got a questionable output past whatever, it's like what you were alluding to with EA Origins earlier, like it makes you think and it makes you worry. And so to that flip side, like with Annapurna and Devolver and bigger publishers, even Finji as they grow, I like that and still like to consider that indie because at the end of the day, I trust these publishers still. And like Annapurna also does not have a perfect track record, right?
No.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that stuff, but I feel like it's hard, right? I think we all still here like AAA games and will play them, but I think it's safe to say the three of us lean more towards indie, are more kind of like cozy and heartfelt experiences or that. Like my top 3 games of the year that I'm fighting over are 2 indies and a Square RPG, but that's it. Like Elden Ring's in the list somewhere, but it's not at the top anymore because just there's so many other experiences. But I think part of what makes indie for me is the vibe, which is so hard to define, but it's how it makes me feel too. Like I got Potion Permit recently after seeing a trailer for it. And like life sims are always tough for me because I like get really intensely into them and then absolutely burn out on them and never finish them. But I saw it and I really fell in love with it. And that's an indie game that I hadn't heard of until I saw it and like fell in love with the minute I started playing it. But I couldn't tell you why, because again, I don't really play a lot of life sims, but that life sim I played and I loved. I mean, same with like Hollow Knight, which I haven't finished, but I enjoyed. It's akin to the Dark Souls difficulty, which I'm hit or miss on, but I loved the aesthetic. I loved the animation. I loved all the other stuff. And there are indie games now that, though, aren't pixel art or like stylistic hand-drawn art. I think about a Plague Tale and its sequel. They're an indie house. And like, they don't look exactly like a AAA studio. Like they struggle in some places, but they're doing 3D models, realistic graphics, which is not a thing we often associate with indies on the broader cliche nature, but that doesn't make them not indie, you know?
Right. Jumping off of that, just because it bothered me so much at the time. I can't remember if it was 2020 or 2021, but Ken and Bridge of Spirits won Best Indie for the Game Awards, which was great. But it also started a very hard discourse for me personally. I kind of backed away and didn't engage with it because it made me so angry. there are a lot of people out there that voted for that game because it looked like a AAA. And they were very
Mhm.
vocal about the fact that they're like, oh, yay, an indie that actually looks like a game. And that was so frustrating to
Yeah.
hear because
That is, yeah.
there is a certain, even within people who praise indies and want to push them, there is sort of still this idea of indies being the thing that you can do if you're like not able to do a AAA, you know? And I just
Right.
find this so upsetting. All of us here, we're talking about like indie games that were our top games of this year over like Elden Ring and God of War and all of that. And to have so many people and people that normally I agree with say things like, well, it's like a real game. And I'm like, no, indie games are 100% a real thing. And in my opinion, a better experience for the most part because they're doing something new and original and fresh. And like I'm currently playing God of War, and
Right.
Mhm.
I'm a huge fan of the series, and I've played all the mainline games before this, and it's great and it's fun and it's doing something kind of new in the AAA space with showing some kind of deeper themes and more thoughtful and
Yeah.
mature. But like I'm not gonna cry at God of War. I mean, I'm afraid of saying that and then something terrible happens to like an
Right.
animal, but
You don't expect to, certainly.
yeah. And if it is, I'm not going to walk away from God of War thinking about myself and my place in the universe.
Right.
But like I walk away from a lot of indies sort of thinking about that. Like, what is it that touched me so profoundly about this particular game? You know, I had a game that I recently reviewed called A Walk with Yaya, I'm gonna say, but it's Yaya, and it's I assume Greek for grandmother.
Yeah.
And it was just this hour-long, very touching experience. And I'm like, I'm going to feel more emotion for that game in the 1 hour that it takes to finish than the however long it's going to take me to finish God of War. Even though I'm like writing down all these notes like, wow, look at the nuance in his performance and you can see like, oh, he's trying to reach out but he can't, like all of
Right.
that. But it's still there's something about the AAA space which doesn't allow for the honesty and real like the real things that kind of touch
Right.
you.
I think one of the things that defines certainly great indie games, but indie games in general for me is deliberate design. Because the larger a game gets, the more people you have invested and vested in its success. And thus there are more hands that come in, more oversight that happens. And I think that is also where the borderline gets a little murky in terms of smaller studios that are published by EA or the like, where it becomes a thing of, yeah, maybe they'll have the money from a larger studio, but how much oversight do they have? Do they bring them the completed game and the studio puts it out there? I think that feels a lot more indie to me because it doesn't have to be the idea. The idea of the video game auteur is bunk,
Yes.
just in general.
Yeah.
But the tighter you can get the deliberate ideas of its design, of its vision, of what it's trying to say, of the amount of time that it is taking to say it. You're absolutely right, Jill. An hour-long game can say so much more than an 80-plus hour game if it knows what to say and is right there about saying it. And I think there's plenty of games that I have purchased recently that distinctly evoke PS1, Sega Saturn, and 64 graphics because they make me happy and they are, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm a gamer of a certain age, as is my spouse who loves 3D collectathons of that time. So I see those and I go, well, this is a very deliberately designed thing. I'm going to give it that chance. And odds are they hit the mark. Are they going to set the world on fire? Are they getting cover stories? No, they don't need that. They don't have to have that. And I think that also is a little bit of an interesting thing as far as the definition of publisher, where a lot of games now don't get a physically published version. So what does a publisher do? And I know we have good ideas on that as far as they put money behind things, they put marketing behind things. They get it in front of people in different ways. But I think, whether or not it looks like a real game, God, that makes me so angry.
So upset.
Yeah.
I had to walk away and I would like fume. I'd walk into
I
the
wanna chew
bedroom and my
glass.
spouse and
Yeah.
I would just like unload And I'm like, I cannot believe that I am hearing this out of people that should know better. And it frustrates me.
Mhm.
And speaking to what you were saying too, not just with like as many people in the kitchen with cooks, everybody knows what I'm trying to say.
You can have 100 people on it, but if they're all working in concert, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And for indies too, unlike a AAA, which picks up its own momentum and steam and it is going from this long legacy. I'm thinking about God of War in particular because that's on my brain.
Absolutely.
But when you make an indie, a lot of the times, it is because you deliberately chose that topic or that point of view or whatever it is. Like that was a chosen from the heart thing.
Yeah.
And everyone's behind the idea, one hopes.
Yeah.
I think very much about Supergiant as a studio in terms of, I think I remember reading about how they don't decide what their next game is going to be until after the last one comes out.
Yeah.
And they are built on the feelings that come from what comes about when it is released.
Well, yeah, and talking about the deliberate design, I mean, some of my favorite games of not just this year, but broadly, again, everyone take a shot. We're going to talk about Shovel Knight. Like Shovel Knight, it's very easy to look at it and go, oh, it's just aping Super Nintendo. It's a copy of DuckTales. But it's not. It takes things from those places. Not even Super Nintendo. It's aping Nintendo style, but definitely could never run on a Nintendo. But like, it's taking bits and pieces of what we associate with our nostalgia, but still purposely making good game design. Like they took... I imagine, I don't know for a fact, but like they were like, we're going to make a Shovel Knight. He's going to use a shovel. He's going to dig. How do we build that, right? And now we have Shovel Knight Dig, which is a game around the digging mechanic specifically, while still paying homage to other games like Dig Dug or, you know, Mr. Driller or whatever else. And for me, that's always going to be my favorite kind of indie because I am so powered by nostalgia. My favorite game of all time is Chrono Trigger. Like I'm looking to recapture those experiences. It's why Live Alive is the only AAA game that's really towards the top of my list. And that still feels indie because it's a pixel art still. And it's, you know,
it's from a time when Squaresoft was kind of an indie studio almost.
Yeah,
not actually an indie studio, but it was certainly largely unknown in the West. It's kind of hard to parse the shift of they made Super Mario RPG to get a little more of a foothold in the West versus Final Fantasy VII.
Right.
But yeah, Live Alive is from before that time.
Yeah. And I'm with you, Joe. Like, I actually didn't like any of the God of War games. I was a Devil May Cry fan through and through, and like purposely was in opposition to God of War.
The fine indie studio Capcom.
Right.
Sorry.
And so I never really liked those old games, but I finished 2018 like a week ago. I'd stopped playing it in 2019 or 2020, like right before the story really picks up, like right before the 1/3 mark. And like I played it while I was sick a few weeks ago and fell in love with that story. Mm-hmm. And so I bought Ragnarok when I wasn't planning on it. So like I have that love for AAA games, nostalgia or not, but there's something about, and we've talked a lot on Twitter about it. You championed my entire playthrough, but like Tunic is very clearly designed for Zelda fans. It's for other people too, but like between collecting the pages of the manual, the way the fox interacts with stuff, the way you find certain gear, like it is absolutely catering to a certain kind of fan and then the people beyond it. Mm-hmm. But the beautiful thing about it is it's not very specifically making Zelda references. It's hinting at it. So like if you've never played a Zelda game, you can still enjoy that. But for me, as someone who prefers the top-down Zelda games, one of my favorite Zelda games of all time is A Link Between Worlds on the 3DS. And so like that game, when I finally played it, was made for me specifically. Yeah. And I just don't feel like I get a ton of those experiences from AAA. I sort of fell into that experience with Sonic Frontiers because I'm a diehard Sonic fan. I've loved that franchise up and down. And while Frontiers is not perfect, it has perfected a next step. It is definitely the best next step they've done in the history of their 3D games for a long time. And so I'm excited about it. I got emotional during some of the cutscenes, but that was less about it being AAA or indie and more about my devotion to that franchise. Whereas I could pick up an indie game that I've never even heard of and be crying by the end of that game because of how heartfelt and personally I feel like they're designed, especially when it's one or two people making the game. I just feel like whatever they're trying to translate just feels more one-to-one. We had the benefit of interviewing the creator of Trombone Champ, and like that's a game that took off because of the memes and everything else. But it is very clear that this one person had a vision to have a joke and fun and to goof. And the people who played it went, I get this thing you're doing. This is really silly and ridiculous. And I just feel like that translates one-to-one on a more personal level with indie games than it does with the big AAA franchises. I got plenty of enjoyment out of Elden Ring, but it was a different kind of connection.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to speak universally, you speak specifically. That is true across most mediums of art.
Yeah.
You speak to a small specific experience, and that speaks to a universal experience. And it becomes difficult when you have a lot of people all bringing their specific experience or trying to make a universal experience as big as possible. And that sort of thing can happen whether it's one person making it or 1,000 people making it. And it gets interesting from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, Jill, do you have a game that you remember as like, this is the first indie game I played? And not necessarily the actual first indie game you played, but maybe the one that you were first aware as a person who plays games. This is an indie game. I think I like indie games. Is there one that like kind of stands out for you?
You know, it's funny because there's really not.
Yeah.
I can remember growing up being a gaming fan and sort of like getting to the realization that like games are made by people and you know
Right, of course.
and there's a whole industry behind it, and there's like strategies behind it, and there's this whole business side behind things and why things happen. But I can't remember specifically going into indies, and I remember very specifically, and this ties into a lot of things about me personally, is that I didn't get into indies until much later in life because partially my experience being a woman in this club, this society of video games, a lot of the times I had to play games that were proving that I was really a gamer.
Yeah.
So if this person that exists currently could not have existed back when I was in middle school and high school, because if I had gone to them and be like, no, you guys, you don't understand, like this little Fox game, this is legit. And I'd be like, oh, that's because you're a girl and girls like cutesy fox things. And so I actually know that like indies are a sign of my personal growth in some ways because
Right.
I was able to shed that sort of, these are what games are, and step into like what games could be, what beautiful experiences they can be. And I wonder how much that happens with others, because a lot of people who are very loud in this space tend to be women. Not that it's like an overwhelming majority or anything, but like if you look at the amount of people who are covering indies in like big outlets, they do tend to skew female, which is a very interesting topic that I would love to like dig into a little more.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's worth it. Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%, because there's something about the AAA space that has its roots way back when like video games were for boys, and
Yeah, very solidified.
that's the audience you were sort of going for. And counterculture that is indies sort of breaks away from all of that. And I just sort of love that. But then there is that, like you were talking about, Matt, the specific keying into, because this industry is now getting to the point where we are adults. Like there are people who have gone their entire lives being gamers who now can go back and feel things about their childhood. Whereas like even the generation before this doesn't have the ability for that expression.
Yeah.
So I find that just so terribly interesting that that is something that's coming up, because indie creators are people now that grew up playing video games and they want to talk about the things that meant a lot to them. And when you think about things that mean a lot to you, you tend to look back a little bit. And, it's like last Tuesday wasn't the hugest milestone in my life, but decades before that. So
those moments that stick around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very interested to see where that goes in the indie space. But I'm also very interested to see what the indie space looks like when the next generation grows up, and indie games have always been a thing that's big.
Right.
Because indie games have been around since games. Like that's
right.
Always.
That's not a question, but I don't think anyone would argue that they have become a very popular category of game now, and
sure,
like an accepted critically and popularly category of game. So I'm very interested to see what people who are kids now, when they grow up, what did they think about indies? Because there's a lot of question marks there, because I mean, we are talking about these bigger publishers, and we've got a market that's just flooded. There's absolutely no way you could play every indie game that comes out in a given week, let alone in the year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so does that mean that these bigger publishers are going to start to control what the market looks like and change that thing that we love so much, that's just like the creator has an idea or the team has an idea that they believe in and they're just going for it? Or do they have to eventually bend to the will of whatever the big voices are? Because if they don't, we were talking about Devolver Digital's kind of MTV thing. If they don't speak to that,
Yeah.
if they don't speak to Annapurna's heartfelt, loving, kind of pensive mood, do they get thrown by the wayside?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
like, what do we think about where this whole space might be going?
And it's going to be really interesting to see the next generation of gamers, what games they considered from what's coming out now to be indie.
Yeah.
It is very interesting to, Jill, you're absolutely right. We are of an age where we grew up gaming, and just like so many other childhood experiences, what you grew up with is normal. Until it's proven otherwise.
Yeah.
You mean you all didn't play MiG-29 on the NES by Codemaster? No? That's not a universal experience, huh? And there's going to be a lot of really cool, wild indie games that people are going to get into game making spaces and they're going to like, oh yeah, my childhood playing this specific game, blank stares. But you're going to get something really cool out of it, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, we're starting to see it a little bit. I mean, it's funny. Like, I think my earliest indie game was before I had the word indie game, right? Think about the Xbox 360, PlayStation Store, WiiWare generation. Like, that's what those games were called. Like, I think the first indie game I ever played was Splosion Man, which I loved, and I love Miss Splosion Man. I have to pick that up on the Switch since it got a re-release because I love that franchise. Or the Behemoth games. Castle Crashers, probably also an early indie game that I played. But I didn't call them indie games then. They were Xbox Live Arcade games. Like, that's what they were. They were digital Xbox Live Arcade games. You couldn't get physical copies. And like, that's where my brain sat. And now that those are getting re-released on other platforms, I'm like, oh yeah, those were indie games also. But even talking about people growing up, we started to see it in the Xbox Live Arcade generation. You think about Double Dragon Neon or Neo. I believe it's Neo, or Streets of Rage 4, which came out recently, or, of course, even more recently, we talk about it on the show a lot because we got to play it and got to interview the devs. The new Ninja Turtles game, Shredder's Revenge, is absolutely an indie game, but it has the original 80s voice cast, the ones that are living at least, and like the style, the design, all of it is based on a very popular cartoon show. And those games that were AAA games when we were kids. You think about Turtles in Time and Hyperstone Heist and Manhattan Project. These were all Konami games that were huge successes. And now we have a indie game doing the exact thing, but better, but based on our memory of it. Because I would argue, of course, the Shredder's Revenge, while it's based on Turtles in Time, is better than that game ever was. But it's not a AAA game, but that was a AAA game, right? And imagine sitting a child down now and putting them in front of Turtles in Time and Shredder's Revenge. They'd look at them both and go, oh, these are the same, right? Like, if you take away the publisher, if you take away the specific graphical fidelity, you're like, oh, this one's newer, so it looks a little nicer, but these are the same, right?
I have at least one 3-year-old I need to test this on. Excuse me.
But like, and that's what's really fascinating is we're going to see more and more of that. Jeff and I like to talk about how a lot of indie games are games that are championing an old aesthetic, but could never run on those old systems. Like we said with Shovel Knight before, or even The Messenger, which I loved, which is absolutely a Nintendo/Super Nintendo game because it literally goes from 8 to 16-bit as you time travel. But Super Nintendo could never probably even run that mechanic, right? Because it literally reskins all the sprites on the entire stage, unless you're at like a hard point where you have to time travel. And like, that's the kind of thing that's really fascinating to me because a young kid, I don't even think at this point would know the difference. They're just all video games, right?
Right.
And that's kind of a refreshing feeling. You brought up kind of Bridge of Spirits, which I've wanted to play and haven't had a chance yet. But I often forget that game is an indie game because it was championed by Sony, right? In a way that they've championed some other indie games too. And it's very easy to forget they're indie. And I'm of two minds about that, right? Like, I love that indie games are being held up on the same pedestal as AAA games. I'm getting angry every time I see a tweet about what your game of the year is, a God of War Ragnarok or Elden Ring. And I get why people say that. They are both incredible and impactful games. I started Ragnarok the other day, and the minute Richard Schiff walks in as Odin, looking like Richard Schiff. I was like, this is the best game ever. I love this. But
There's space for both.
Right.
there's space for both. And it just drives me crazy because I'm like, none of those games are my game of the
Right.
year. It's 2 or 3 indie games.
And you're not alone. It's not just us who we're obviously like indie game rah 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 cheerleaders.
Right.
Here, here.
But I recently kind of wrote in protest to this because I think it was a min-max. And by the way, anybody who wants to follow great stuff, go follow min-max.
Please
They
do.
put up a thing that's like, okay, what's game of the year? It was like a poll,
Yeah.
God of War or Elden Ring. And instead of voting, I did a quote like, you spelt tunic wrong twice.
Right.
Which I was very appreciative of and thought that was hilarious and laughed at my own joke. But there were multiple people who were just beneath my comment, just like, yeah, go Jill, this is right.
Yeah.
So it's like there is a large segment of the population for whom that's not correct anymore. And some of this discussion, some of the AAA supremacy is perhaps manufactured.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I used to be a part of a big outlet and a big name. And
Yeah.
there is some very interesting dynamics to like kind of the politics of AAA versus indies, because if I were still there, I would be arguing this year that Tunic was the best. And
Yeah.
I'm not being facetious. I was going to argue for that being the game of the year. But I don't think anybody out there would be surprised to learn that Tunic would never be game of the year for a
No.
big outlet. And it's really
No.
hard. I think there are still people who see an indie title and review it and don't believe that it can get above a certain amount.
Score.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A certain threshold
Yeah.
of
Like
Right.
clout.
the best possible indie is like an 8, essentially.
Right. Which is not true. And I think also part of that frustration is, and I've heard this talked about a lot on Waypoint. I have Waypoint on the mind because I recently chatted with Patrick Klepek, and they've called it out too. There are people in this world who aren't terminally online, fatally online like we are, and
Yeah.
they play the one big game a year.
Yeah.
And for someone who does that during the cyberpunk kerfuffle, which I will call kindly now, but that nightmare, someone who just plays the one big AAA game would see cyberpunk and go, oh, I'm going to play that game. That looks great.
Mhm.
They may not be tuned into all the stuff that's happening, you know, in the same way that someone playing Overwatch now may be like, oh, my game is back, right? The sequel's out now and I can play it. And you can't always fault people for not being informed because it is so skewed. People can find that information, and video games especially are becoming bigger and more known. But I feel like a lot of what falls under that and why we see like is Game of the Year one of these two giant games is because the mass media, the broad audience, doesn't know what Tunic is, doesn't know what Citizen Sleeper is, doesn't know what Shovel Knight Dig is. And that's, I think, what's really frustrating. And it's a vicious cycle. And I don't want to call out any publications because I have friends at pretty much all of them. But like
Everyone's trying their best.
and everyone's trying their best, but you absolutely are catering to your larger audience most of the time, especially when there's a big company backing it. And the mass audience knows God of War,
Yeah.
Call of Duty, Elden Ring, and that's not their fault either because Bandai Namco and the like, Sony, Santa Monica Studios, can all put way more money into advertising visibility and like send out codes and like reach more people than those smaller companies can. I mean, thankfully, there are some incredible PR agencies that I've worked with personally who are pushing a ton of indie games, and I've gotten to see a ton of indie games because there are indie games now that I might not have ever heard of if it weren't for them. And on the same token, like Xbox Live was very much a champion of indie games in a way that at the time not a lot of places were. And I feel like now Nintendo is finally getting back to that. They did a little bit in the 3DS and Wii U era, but now with the Switch, not only are they championing indies, but they have a whole separate like silo for Indie World for their streams and lives about just indie games. There was one that I had seen with like you play as a red panda, and it's this discovery game that very much kind of had a Tunic vibe.
Right. Is that Aka?
Aka, yeah.
Yes.
And like
Adorable.
like after it appeared on
remembering
after it appeared on the direct, I then got an email. It's like, hey, do you want to, you know, talk about our game? And I was like, yes, I do. I love indie games. So I think we're getting to a point where they are becoming more ubiquitous, but they are nowhere near as ubiquitous as the AAA stuff. And I think it's the same thing with indie movies and indie music. Like all of them have gone through this cycle, but we've hit the point now where indie movies are pretty ubiquitous, and like Annapurna's movies are sometimes just as big and or draw as big audiences as the big blockbusters.
Right.
And
I mean, I think a lot of people that I've talked to are pretty set. Like a lot of people that I've talked to are pretty set with Everything Everywhere All at Once being the best movie this year. So I think this is a very interesting conversation. It is sort of a like reflection, like who's doing the reflecting and who's actually originating things.
right.
And it's part of the real, one of the big reasons why I really loved running the Indian Farmer, because I don't have to worry about a lot of these things that the bigger places have to worry about. Like I'm not generating
Mhm.
revenue off of clicks. So
Yeah.
if someone writes to me and says, "Hey, I have a game that came out and it's not doing particularly great. I would love some more attention on it." Like, go check it out. And I check it out and I go, "Hey, this actually is something that's kind of cool." And I get to just write about that. When I was a Game Informer, that is not something I had the freedom to do a lot of the time, even though I will say, like, my boss and a lot of people around me and editor-in-chief, who is no longer editor-in-chief anymore, but they were all very cool with me doing indie stuff. Like, I
Yeah.
got away with a
Mhm.
lot of indie coverage that I probably shouldn't have. But even with all of that sort of like backup and support and that sort of thing, like it was still my job to like, we get that you like Tunic, but you have to write about this big game now, because we do have to get like Tunic is so fantastic and I want it to be a click driver, but it is just not. It
Right.
is
Yeah.
disappointing how low those numbers are for a lot of indie games that I'm like, this is a huge indie game, and I'm trying to
Yeah.
argue that to my bosses, and I can't find the numbers to back it up, even though there's conversation about how great everything is, and it's getting amazing scores critically. And
Yeah.
so like, is it a thing where it's like the big outlets don't talk about it and therefore we don't talk about it? Is it that there are those people out there that just play that one big game that everyone's heard of, but why do they only hear about the one big game, and are we a self-perpetuating sort of machine?
Yeah.
It's a many-armed machine because, yeah, it is very easy to sit and go, well, the larger publications are trying to force a monolith that we have outgrown as an industry and as a medium. But also, yeah, there are definitely those people that are like, I play one game a year, because larger games are getting larger and our games as service. So you can reasonably, I say reasonably with whatever fun punctuation check you want to throw on that, reasonably put a 500, 1,000 hours into the game. And so, yeah, you play one game a year. You're going to pour all that. You want me to play all these smaller games? That's ridiculous. And there's always the, I don't know about everyone else, but I definitely feel that emotional revving up that has to happen to start a new game, big or small. Smaller games make it easier. And as I play more indie games, it becomes easier and easier to be like, well, let me just throw that on and fall in love. But not everyone does, and not everyone puts that time in. We've brought up film a couple of times this episode, and I think it's the same thing. People that just watch big blockbusters, just go to MCU films, may not necessarily scoff at smaller films, but they just don't go see them. Are they being talked about or whatever that is? And and unfortunately, we are all too varied, and it is a very large industry, and it's such a pain in the ass to try to nail this down, but I want to. God, I want to.
Yeah. I mean, and that's why Geoff and I also champion indie games here. I mean, one, it's just because we love them and we've made such incredible connections with the developers themselves, the creators, the publishers. And
Found so many great experiences in the game and without.
Right. And we love championing them as well. And I feel like we championed the Shovel Knights, but I feel like the Shovel Knights have gotten enough, not enough, but they get a lot of notoriety. But like, it's why it's so important. Like, we're doing an interview later this year or early next year, depending on timing, with the developer behind the big con, which I would have never played if they had not reached out to us. And I ended up really liking. And I think that championing those kinds of games are just as important. And we have the freedom to do that because there are no rules. Like, Geoff and I are also discussing possibly reviewing more stuff and not just doing straight discussions. Never a number rating, though. Even if we review something, no number ratings. Not necessary.
Well, and I think, again, with the deliberate design of indie games, or the ideal deliberate design, it becomes less of a matter of how many out of 10 or how many thumbs up out of thumbs, but it becomes more of it's like being a sommelier. Like, who is this for? Who
Right.
wants
Yes.
this? What sort of experience does this go with? And I think that's going to be, while it's less bite-sized and it's more nuanced, so it's a little harder to delve into, I think is ultimately more aligned. And yeah, again, we are also very small. So we can get away with that. And we're not being driven by clicks or revenue. So we can get away with that. And I like that.
Yeah. I think ultimately for me, indie game it's a vibe. It's a feeling, right? Like, I don't think there are any right answers, but I think for me, I'm always going to gravitate towards indies more than AAA because of most simply and mathematically the time commitment. Like, I am currently playing Persona 5 Royal. We talked about on a recent episode because I have it on the Switch and I can take it on the go. I bounced off it incredibly hard on the PS4 when it was just Persona 5, but Royal, because it is bite-sized and I can save almost at any time and I can literally put the system to sleep, plug it in and step away, it becomes a bite-sized experience. It becomes an indie game in my perception because of the bite-sized experience, even though this is like a 100-hour game that will probably take me the rest of the year to finish. But like, I find with the AAA game, the biggest thing, the hurdle is like, I don't have 100 hours to do anything, let alone play a game. Oh, you're telling me this Fox game is 6 hours long, but can be up to 10 or 15 if I want to explore everything? Great, I'm in. Let's do it, you know? And I think that ultimately is what pushes me and Geoff back to the indie experiences is it feels more approachable. It feels more bite-sized. Shocking as it may be that we're a bunch of nerds with anxiety, diving into something that's a long-term commitment. I hate abandoning games. I've accepted it and I started to do it more. And I'm not forcing myself to play a game I'm not enjoying. But on the same token, I'm a completionist at heart. And by completionist, I don't mean the Gerard Khalil get everything, although I do that for some games. I mean I want to see something to the end. I've watched TV shows and movies I didn't like because I wanted to know how it ended, right? And like for video games too, that's much easier to do on a 3 to 5 hour experience than it is to do on a 60-hour experience with a bajillion side quests.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately for me, indie will be about the size, but that doesn't mean you can't have a 30 to 40 or 50-hour indie game. I feel like Sea of Stars, which I'm so excited for. I love The Messenger. I hope that's like a 40-hour or 30-hour experience because they're making a JRPG that feels like a true old school JRPG, and those were pretty long. So I think ultimately there's no right answer. Jill, thank you for joining us to help us try and like swim through the ether that is indie games.
To make everything a little murkier.
Joyously murky.
Yes.
Joyously murky. But we appreciate having you and we will absolutely have you back. I would love before we wrap up for you to tell folks where they can find you online, they can find your work online, find the Indie Informer and all that good stuff. Plug the awesomeness that is you.
So if you want to, you can just Google Indie Informer, it'll pop up. But for the most part, I am on Twitter. Let's see how long that lasts.
Right. Yeah. Who knows?
But you can follow me at Finruin. That's FINRUIN. And I am usually, anytime that I put something up, I do a little tweet about what it is and a little synopsis of what I thought of it. So you can go through there. You can just find online and scroll down and see what I've been doing. Recently, I went to the Day of the Devs in-person event, and I was able to play a lot of different games, and I am still writing previews based off of that. So previews are going up. I've got a lot of really cool things, and hopefully people are listening to this podcast there as well.
Fantastic.
Yes, thank you. Please go check out everything that Jill does. I wanted to have Jill on for a little while, and we will definitely have Jill back. I want to personally shout out Little Kitty, Big City.
Yes.
That preview is great. It's got me. I am a dog person. Everyone who follows me knows I have a cute little puppy, but I'm a sucker for cat stories. I did enjoy Stray. And so, like, this one, which seems a lot goofier than Stray, seems like it's going to be right up my alley. But definitely go check out all of Jill's writing. It's really incredible. And tell us, how do you define indie games? I feel like we've asked this question before, but I'm always curious because it always varies. What, if you're listening, is the thing that is core to the vibe of an indie game for you? Is it the graphics? Is it the music? Because we didn't even talk anything about the incredible chiptune scores, the Jake Kaufmans of the world and beyond. There's so much more to indie games than just even the stuff we talked about. So please let us know like where you fall in the indie world. And if you've not played an indie game, why? What turns you off to the idea of playing an indie game?
Yeah, what are the core pieces? What has to stay if everything else falls away to define what an indie is for you? Is it something where you can forgive all of the imperfections a little more? As speaking of indie cat games, as somebody who played a lot of Calico when it first came out, is an indie game one where you almost relish when it glitches out and causes problems versus a AAA title where you go, I paid $70 for this? Is that what it is for you? It might be. It might be for me. And I wonder how it is for you. What have been your favorite indie game experiences? What have been your favorite strange discoveries because one person made it or one person told you about it? What are the games that you want to champion for other people? How do you feel about game jams and game collections, the indie apocalypses and mixtapes of the world? I want to have the people who make those on here as well. I want to talk about those things because those are a great way to get different experiences out there and to package smaller bite-sized gaming experiences that are as long as they need to be. And typically indie games are shorter because you don't have enough time and budget to pad them out. But you put them all together, it's something great. And we want to hear about all of that from all of you. And there's so many great ways to get in touch with us. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Fun and Games Pod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Tell us what you thought about this episode, previous episodes, and what you'd like to hear in future episodes, series retrospectives, guests, games talked about. We are trying to do so many different things because we love the indie gaming space and games in general, and we want to be able to have these conversations with you. You can also go to certainpov.com and find not only a permanent invite link to our Discord server, but also so many other fantastic Certain POV podcasts.
Please share your thoughts with us. Ultimately, we do this for y'all. Thank you for listening. If you have a moment, please rate and review us on your podcast platform of choice. I know you're tired of hearing it, but I'm never going to be tired of saying it. It literally is the thing that helps us the most. Whether you throw money at us or the other shows or whatever, absolutely rating and reviewing us on your podcast platform of choice helps us immensely because it helps our discoverability and helps other folks like-minded with us, especially indie game lovers, to join in the conversation and join us. Please hang out and chat with us on the Discord. We are talking a lot about games as we are in the heart of gaming season, as we like to call it. There are AAA games galore. I cannot keep up. But yeah, please keep interacting with us, sharing with us, telling us what you love. We love constructive criticism as well. Like, we want you to enjoy the show and continue to grow it. So thank you for interacting with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, the reviews and stars are not just for validating us, but they do validate us.
That's true.
Well, putting that out there increases engagement and it gets more people here to be part of the conversation, because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey there, Screen Beans. Have you heard about Screen Snark?
Rachel, this is an ad break. They aren't screen beans until they listen to the show.
Fine. Potential Screen Beans. You like movies and TV shows, right?
I mean, who doesn't? Screen Snark is a casual conversation about the movies and television shows that are shaping us as we live our everyday lives.
That's right, Matt. We have a chat with at least one incredible guest every episode, hailing from all walks. We've interviewed chefs,
Writers, costumers, musicians,
yoga teachers, comedians, burlesque dancers,
folks in the film and TV industry,
and more.
We'd be delighted for you to join us every other Monday on the Certain POV Podcast Network.
Or wherever you get your podcasts, fresh and tasty off the presses.
What? That's not.
Can I call them Screen Beans now?
Fine.
Screen Beans.
So tune in and we'll see you at the movies or on a couch somewhere.
'Cause you're all Screen Beans now.
She will be mine.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.